Module 15, the urinary system. Anatomy of the urinary system. Before I discuss the processes in this system, let's first take a look at its anatomy. The major organs of this system are the kidneys. There's one on each side of the body, but they are at slightly different positions. This is because the liver takes up more space on the right side of the body, so the right kidney has to be a bit lower. The kidneys each have a tube that the urine travels through as it leaves them. There are two ureters which lead to the single urinary bladder. As I mentioned in the previous section, the urinary bladder is a sac that will store the urine until it's time to be voluntarily emptied. As more and more urine enters the urinary bladder, it will stretch because it's made up of smooth muscle. This muscle is made up of stretchy stratified transitional epithelium. When it is time to expel the urine, it leaves via the urethra, which leads to the outside of the body. Let's take a better look at the location of the kidneys in the body. This is a cross-section of the abdomen looking downward at it. Here is the anterior side of the body, and here's the posterior side. This cavity is the peritoneal cavity, and it contains most of the abdominal organs, such as the liver, stomach, and pancreas. Surrounding the peritoneal cavity is a membrane called the parietal peritoneum, which is made up of a serous membrane that produces some fluid for its cavity. Now, notice how the kidneys are not in this cavity. They are located posterior to it, so they are said to be retroperitoneal organs. Retroperitoneal means behind the parietal peritoneum. You may remember that when I talked about the respiratory system, I mentioned how the lungs were surrounded by special membranes for several reasons. It's the same way with the organs within the peritoneal cavity. Each is surrounded by another smooth serous membrane that's called the visceral peritoneum. So the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum help to moisten the organs they surround, so there is minimal friction as those organs brush up against one another and against the cavity wall. The kidneys don't move very much as the body moves, and that's for an important reason. You see, though the other organs within the body cavity move around a bit as you bend and stretch, the kidneys can't. This is because they are kept more firmly in place by a layer of fatty or adipose tissue. This layer is called perirenal fat, and it's an important layer of tissue. If a person were to become severely starved, then that perirenal fat layer would shrink, and the kidneys could slip out of place. If they were to move, the ureter that leads out of the kidneys could get compressed or twisted, and that would be bad because it would block the flow of urine into the bladder. Now, let's take a closer look at the anatomy of the kidneys themselves. These organs are bean-shaped organs about 5 inches in length. They're surrounded by a renal capsule made up of fibrous connective tissue. We actually can divide a kidney into two major regions. The outer region is called the cortex, and the inner region is called the medulla. The material in the medulla is made up of cone-shaped structures called renal pyramids. The pyramids back up to the renal cortex. This is the location where urine is produced. Each renal pyramid is separated from one another by renal columns, which are extensions of the material found in the cortex. The tips of the renal pyramids are called renal papillae, and they point inwards where they meet funnel-shaped structures called minor calyces, or the singular, minor calyx. Urine moves from the pyramids into the minor calyces, which lump together to form major calyces. The major calyces merge together to form the renal pelvis. This structure becomes narrower and narrower until it forms the ureter, which is the pathway out of the kidney. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. It is the location of blood filtration, and it's composed of a very specifically folded tubule. Nephrons extend into both the medulla and the cortex of the kidney, beginning right about here. This part of the nephron is in the kidney's cortex, and this part extends into the medulla, kind of like this in the diagram, only the nephrons are smaller. Blood in the cortex of the kidney moves into the nephron at a location called the renal corpuscle. The tube-shaped part of the nephron moves into the kidney's medulla and then curves back in the opposite direction and travels back to the cortex. From there, it moves into a collecting duct, which goes back into the medulla and then goes to a minor calyx. Now, the renal corpuscle is the starting point of the nephron. It's the location of blood filtration, consisting of a capsule called the Bowman's capsule, along with a cluster of capillaries called the glomerulus. The tubular extension out of the renal corpuscle begins with the proximal tubule and then to the loop of Henle. It is this loop that extends inward to the kidney's medulla and then back into the cortex. The cortex is where the loop of Henle meets the distal tubule. Now, not all nephrons have a loop of Henle. In fact, only about 10% of them do. But it's those nephrons with loops of Henle that are responsible for the concentration of urine, so we will focus on them. You have about 1.3 million nephrons in each of your kidneys. Yet the body can still work functionally as long as at least a third of these nephrons are functioning. If less than that are working, the body can't survive. This is why people are able to live if they donate a kidney. If their kidneys are healthy, then half the number of working nephrons or a single kidney provides enough filtration for the body to live. I have focused primarily on the names and locations of the organs and components of the urinary system. In the following sections, we'll focus on the process of filtration, especially focusing on the primary unit within the kidney, the nephron. To sum up then, we can say that the first function of the urinary system is to filter the blood in order to form urine. This is a process that removes wastes from the blood. That waste can include materials that shouldn't be in the blood, such as urea, or excess materials in the blood, such as too much sodium or water. The second function of this system is to control blood pH. You see, the kidneys are able to alter the concentration of hydrogen ions in the blood. And as I introduced in a previous module, the amount of hydrogen ions in blood determines the blood pH. More hydrogen ions, lower pH, and vice versa. The third function of the urinary system is to regulate blood pressure. The fourth function is to stimulate a process called erythropoiesis. Erythropoiesis is the production of red blood cells, or erythrocytes. What happens is that kidney cells can identify if there's not enough oxygen in the blood, so they will make a hormone called erythropoietin. This hormone moves through the blood to the red bone marrow, where it behaves as a signal to stimulate the bone marrow to increase erythrocyte production. The fifth function of the urinary system is to activate vitamin D. Remember that vitamin D is made when the skin is exposed to sunlight, but it has to be activated in order to do its job, so that's what the kidney cells do. The sixth function of the urinary system is to transport urine via the ureters. And the seventh and final function of this system is to store and release urine. It's stored in the urinary bladder and is expelled upon a conscious decision.